Hello there and welcome to this live stream from Cloud with Chris. You're with me, Chris Reddington, and normally on this channel we talk about all things cloud. And today we will be doing exactly that. We are talking as part of the Global Azure 2021 virtual conference. So welcome if you are joining and you're new to the channel. Welcome. Glad to have you here. And if you're a familiar face and you've seen some of my content already before, welcome back and glad to have you with me here today. So as I mentioned, today is a live stream. We're part of Global Azure 2021, and today we're going to be doing a talk all about how GitHub can be used to help in planning, building, and deploying a podcast or a blog site. So I'm going to be talking all about cloudwithchris.com and how I go ahead and use cloudwithchris.com, or rather use GitHub to deploy cloudwithchris.com, I should say. So with that, let's go ahead, just jump across to the screen share and get things kicked off here. Okay, so how GitHub can help in planning, building, and deploying a podcast blog site. So this is actually the second of my sessions for Global Azure 2021. If you missed my one yesterday, it is on my channel and available, so you can go ahead and check that out. It is all about using static websites and being able to host those on Azure. And that is really the basis actually of this talk as well. But rather than focusing on the implementation details behind the scenes and what Azure technologies I use, I'm going to be talking all about the GitHub aspects and how I use GitHub to go ahead and deploy and build and plan my podcast, cloudwithchris.com, as well as blog, etc., onto Azure directly. So, in case you don't know me, we'll do some introductions in a moment, but before we do, just want to go ahead and bring this up on screen here. Like any good conference, we always love swag, whether that is as a speaker or an attendee or whatnot. And the Global Azure team have done an amazing job in organizing this virtual event. Trying to coordinate a global event in a virtual world, I think, is challenging, but I think the team have done a brilliant job. And they've also arranged for some swag as well. So go ahead and claim your learner badge using the QR code on screen there. There's also a 30 days to learn link there for you to use as well. And then some virtual background and another badge if you are interested as well. So I'll just leave that on screen here for a moment, just in case you're interested in picking up some of that swag. Okay, and with that, let's go ahead and do some introductions. So my name is Chris Reddington. So for those of you who aren't a regular on my channel, I am a cloud solution architect at Microsoft. That is my day job. And then what I do during the evenings and during the night, etc., is I do a lot of podcasting, blogging, vlogging. So Cloud with Chris, for example, the YouTube channel you're currently watching on, is what I actually stream from and record on generally. And that is really what we're going to be talking about in this session here today, in this particular talk. I'm also the co-organizer of Azure Thames Valley, so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And I also, in my spare time, as you can probably guess by the frames behind me, I also enjoy musical theatre. I do a bit of dramatics myself and an improving improviser, but with COVID-19, haven't had the chance to go and do some of those hobbies, unfortunately, but hopefully soon. So if you like this content, I'd really appreciate you liking the video, subscribing to the channel, Cloud with Chris. You're watching it on YouTube currently, or you may be listening after the fact on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, because I am present there as well. And cloudwithchris.com, you can also listen and watch there as well. And if you just want to get into discussions on Twitter, maybe you have some questions at all, at RedOBowen, that is my Twitter handle. So please feel free to follow, get in touch. Would love to continue the discussion there. So with that, we'll just quickly introduce as well Azure Thames Valley, as I mentioned. Azure Thames Valley is a local user group here in the UK, and I am one of the co-organisers of that. And we've got some great sessions coming up. I think we're booked until about August or September now in terms of speakers and speaker slots. AzureThamesValley.com, which is coincidentally also a static website if you're interested. And then we are, of course, on Meetup. That is our main platform. So generally, we're a local group, so when things resume, we'll be continuing in person, but we also plan to continue virtually. So if you'd like to join us and see the types of speakers that we've got coming along as well, please do go ahead and join up on the meetup.com page there as well, as we'd love to have you along with us. Now, what would be great before we kick off here is I'm going to be monitoring the chat. I will do my best to keep up to date with it. And, if there's any questions, I'm happy to go off course as needed. Just absolutely please shout. But let's get a bit of interaction going here first. So I'd love to know, what is your experience with Azure? What is your experience with GitHub, with GitHub Actions, and this open source static site generator framework called Hugo? So feel free to put in the chat window whether you're beginner, intermediate, or advanced with each of those, as it just helps me make sure I kind of tell the story in the right way for my audience who are listening in today. So please feel free to do that whilst we're doing some of the introductions here. Now, this talk, as I mentioned, is going to be all around GitHub, some of the core features and some of the core aspects that I typically use anyway during Cloud with Chris and my deployment, planning and building of that. But we're also going to understand some of the core fundamental concepts, if you like, of GitHub Actions as well, not just some of the core features of GitHub. We're going to be particularly focusing on GitHub Actions. And then we're also going to explore where there may be some existing samples available to help you deploy to Azure, and then understand why I've actually taken the decision to use GitHub and GitHub Actions as well. Excellent. I can see Techie Last there has joined the chat, knows a bit about Azure, and the others can get by on. Excellent. Welcome, and thank you for joining. So, in terms of GitHub then, and a bit of context and a bit of background for anyone who is not familiar. GitHub was actually founded back in 2008. So a lot of people think of GitHub as this brand new platform, and I guess, a lot of people have been raising the awareness of it since the Microsoft acquisition, but it's actually been around now for about 13 years. It's been around for quite some time. And Microsoft became a significant user of it around 4 years after it launched, actually. And when you think about some of the projects that are now hosted on there, like .NET Core, for example, VS Code, think about things as well like the Roslyn compiler, and so many other examples. Think about even just some of the contributions back from a Kubernetes perspective, like some of the App Gateway Ingress Controller and all of these types of solutions as well. There's so many different areas where Microsoft is contributing back to open source. And that's partly why one of the reasons then Microsoft went and acquired in 2018 GitHub for the price of $7.5 billion. Not quite what I have in change, unfortunately, but a good sum of money for the company. So GitHub has actually been a part, or a subsidiary of Microsoft, I should say, for the last 3 years or so now. And what you've seen over that time is really this evolution of GitHub, because a lot of people see GitHub as just this Git version control hosting that you can go and use, which absolutely, that is where it started, but it is so much more than that, and we'll be really covering that in this session today here. So in 2019, you started to see some of this evolution happening, where GitHub started offering unlimited private repositories to all plans. So even if you were a free user, you started having the ability to have these unlimited free private repositories, which you didn't have previously. Then they also acquired Seml, a code analysis tool, and we'll be touching upon that here today. But one thing really to take away from this session, GitHub is doing some amazing things in the DevSecOps space. We won't really cover it in depth, unfortunately, today. But if you're interested in bringing security into your workflows and into your pipelines, you definitely need to check out CodeQL, Seml, Dependabot, and some of those pieces. But we'll slightly touch upon those later. Then in 2020, that open source, focus continues, and GitHub announced that they were acquiring NPM then as well. So NPM is the kind of package management functionality for Node. So again, that's been brought into GitHub, and now GitHub are kind of the custodians of that, if you like, and helping drive that forwards even further. And then in April of 2020, so about a year ago now, the free plan that we mentioned a bit earlier, now unlimited collaborators are allowed, but for private repositories, there is a limit on the number of GitHub actions per month. So the GitHub team realized there is a need for, these free plans to have these private repositories. So that's now been opened up to unlimited contributors as well, which is a great addition there and a great benefit, for people like myself who might need to go and work in some private repositories until I go and make something public from an open source perspective. So, as I say, GitHub has been around for quite some time, and just a little fun fact and a fun bit back to the community. There is a tool, github.com/nomangool/octocat-day. So it's a community-driven tool there that you can go ahead and find out when you actually joined GitHub. So how old you are in terms of GitHub. So I'm about a month away actually from being 10 years old on GitHub, which I thought was kind of a fun fact actually for this presentation as well. So go ahead and check that out, and hopefully that gives you some context into GitHub. And before we jump in, one of the things just to really touch upon here is that GitHub is not just about Git. Git is the version control that you will go and use when you're using GitHub. However, there is so much more than that, and that's what we'll be focusing on this particular page here. It's so much more than just version control. Now, people often ask, or when we're starting to talk about Git in certain discussions, they'll say, oh yeah, Microsoft have GitHub, yeah, that's Git. And they are two slightly different concepts. Imagine the idea of like a vacuum cleaner, for example, and compare that to Git. Vacuum cleaner, there are many types of vacuum cleaners out there. You might have a Dyson, you might have a Hoover, you might have a Henry, for example, whatever it may be. But with Git, you have different hosting platforms that you can host your Git repositories on. So for example, Azure DevOps, GitLab, Bitbucket, and GitHub are all examples of different platforms you might go and host your Git repositories on. So GitHub is one of these platforms that we can host our Git repositories on. But as I say, it's so much more than just the version control. When we think about things like automation, and continuous integration and continuous delivery or deployment, that ability to convert that code into our applications that then we ultimately go and deploy, we need to have some kind of build and release process around that. And that's where something like GitHub Actions would come in. But it also focuses on automation, not just CI/CD. And we'll take a little bit of a look at that a little bit later here as well. Security, I've mentioned, is a big part of GitHub, and I think a real niche actually for GitHub. Honestly, it's such a great area where the investment is really growing and growing. And as I say, we won't be covering it in this session in too much depth, but if that is important and bringing that into your pipeline, go and take a look into CodeQL and Dependabot in particular. And there's so many other features there. There's a mobile application now. We've now got a dark theme, which came out just before Christmas. There's project management functionality with GitHub Issues, for example, team administration, and obviously all focused around community and this idea of the open source community. So things like GitHub sponsors, for example, and being able to sponsor those open source projects. All of these just show really that focus on open source from a GitHub perspective. Now we're going to be focusing on these three areas here: the collaborative coding, the automation and CI/CD, and project management. So how I go ahead and bring all of those concepts into my workflow with cloudwithchris.com. So cloudwithchris.com, the way I actually build and deploy that is using a static site generator. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, if you didn't have a chance to catch my session yesterday, it is on my YouTube channel. And in that session, I talk all about how to go and host a static website using Azure technologies. So either Azure Storage, Azure CDN, static web apps, Azure CDN, for example. And this session today is more about the automation, the kind of CI/CD and the DevOps principles using GitHub behind that. Or at least that's how I do mine for Cloud with Chris. So Hugo is the tool that I particularly use. You don't have to go and use Hugo. There are others out there, Jekyll, Gatsby, ViewPress, and friends. But Hugo is a particular favorite of mine. There's a great community that support it. I've been building a couple of themes, my Cloud with Chris theme, for example, as well as a theme for local conferences and meetup groups that I've kind of open sourced for the community. So really welcoming community, some great talks to get started. So if you're looking for something to get started along that journey, personally, I think Hugo is a great technology, and I'm a big fan of it for my own work that I've been doing. Now, in terms of Cloud with Chris and the architecture, just to give you a bit of a flavor of the back end, again, in case you didn't see yesterday's session, there are three main types of technologies that I'm using from an Azure perspective: Azure DNS, Azure CDN, and Azure Storage. And the type of CDN that I'm using from Azure CDN is the Microsoft CDN flavor, so the standard CDN from Microsoft there. There are other flavors. You've got Akamai, you've got Verizon as well. I chose to go for the standard Microsoft one. So there's no backend servers, there's no AKS, there's no virtual machines, there's no compute. It's storage, CDN, and DNS. So what that means is we're using Hugo to generate the files that we need, the HTML files, the CSS, the images, pushing that up to blob storage. And then our end users are going through a CDN to go and access that content. So the benefit of that is it's closer to our end users, so it's distributed globally across the world. And because I have users in Australia, in the United States, in Europe, I need that. That is something important to me. And it also acts as a little bit of a protection layer, a buffer in front of those storage accounts then, so they don't get overwhelmed. So that's a quick bit on the architecture. And with that, that is really all that I wanted to do in terms of scene setting here. Let's go ahead, jump in and get hands-on with GitHub and show some of the key concepts here. But before we do, I just want to quickly show here, this is my bill for the last month, and this is the entire month, as I say. This is running all of those environments that you saw earlier. So preview, staging, production, hosting my podcast files, all of the streaming through the CDN as well. So because I'm running on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and all of those streaming files get pulled from my CDN, that includes absolutely everything there. So £4.26 to run for the entire month there. So a really cost-effective way of hosting that solution. So again, if you haven't seen the static content session from yesterday, go ahead, check out that one there. So with that, this is my website, www.cloudwithchris.com. Now what you'll notice as I start scrolling down here, typical blog podcast style website here. I've got different types of content going on. I can go and look through the paginated pages here. I've got an about me page with all of these images, etc., of talks and things I've done in the past. Can go look at the episodes, can go look at the blog, for example, what talks are coming up, and we can of course see my global Azure talks here. We could even be very meta and watch the current talk live here as well, for example, but we won't do that. That'll get too Inception-like and guests, etc. here. Now notice as I've been navigating through the site that actually it's very snappy, it's very quick to load, with thanks to that CDN, because we're pulling those files from a local point of presence. So whilst the storage account is in North Europe, I as an end user am not necessarily going to North Europe. If there's a point of presence from that global distributed cache and those various points of distribution, I will be served from that location, meaning I get a great end user experience and a very snappy experience there as well. And just one thing again as a bit of a teaser for the session I did yesterday, I've kept mentioning about this idea of static content. You are not just limited to sites being completely static. There's a concept in the modern web development world called Jamstack, which stands for JavaScript APIs and Markup. So I've written my website using Markdown, and I have some themes in the back end I've created. And you can go ahead and use JavaScript and APIs to enhance that functionality so it doesn't feel as static. So as an example, I have some search functionality on my website. I can go and search for Git and see all of the different content that is on my website from a Git perspective, or a GitHub, or a gateway, for example, or a code, whatever it may be. So, and you can see how quickly that search was as well, because again, all it's doing is some JavaScript, which is passing through a JSON file, which has been generated by Hugo and is stored in the static content, so stored on my CDN. So again, really cost effective, really efficient, and well performant there as well. So let's jump across here to another tab. You can see this is my staging website. Doesn't really look any different because this is effectively my pre-release environment here. So again, very, very snappy behind a CDN here. All the same points that we mentioned a bit earlier. And then I've also got this preview.cloudwithchris.com as well. And what this allows me to do is go ahead and have a number of different environments which are focused on the content that is not quite ready to go live yet, but I just want to go ahead, see how it looks, see how it renders. Maybe I might share it with some people just to get some reviews and thoughts ahead of time, for example. So I can go ahead, go into my preview folder. I can see this global Azure update, which I've prepared for this session. So I'd go ahead, go to the index folder, or index file, I should say there. And now we can see everything's loading up there. I might go in, take a look at my talks. And what you'll notice differently here is now it doesn't display the global Azure talks in my upcoming section anymore. They're now sessions which took place in the past. So that's what we'll be releasing throughout this particular talk here. So you can get an idea of those different types of sites or different platforms, I guess, and different environments that I am hosting here. So less than £5 for a month for all of that to be hosted, including the streaming to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and the like as well there. So how do I actually go and manage my podcast and my blog and my content, and how do I go and build and deploy all of that? That's what we'll be talking about here, and how I use GitHub to go and manage all of that. So first thing, let's just zoom in a little bit there just to make sure you can see that okay. And the first thing I want to touch upon here is GitHub issues. So GitHub issues is a very lightweight way of tracking, as it says, issues. But it doesn't have to be issues. They could be things like feature requests. It's a way for you to have a very, very light and easy backlog to go and manage. So this is actually how I manage all of my content with Cloud with Chris, what is coming up over the coming months, the different types of series that I'm working on, etc., etc. So you can see here that I've got all of my various content pieces listed here in my issues backlog. Now I can go ahead, filter down by milestones, see what's coming up in April, for example. I can go take a look at the various projects that I'm working on here as well, or the labels that I've assigned, so what blogs I'm working on this month. You can see I've already released some there. My Cloud Drops content coming up, or maybe my Cloud Gaming Notes content coming up. This is not such a great example for this month because I've released a lot of that this month, but here we go. You get the idea there in terms of filtering through. So we can go ahead and add a few more in there. Now, what if you're not a person who likes to go kind of item by item and understand things? Maybe you're a little more visual. Well, this is where GitHub Projects comes in, and you can actually add those GitHub issues to these GitHub projects. You don't have to. You can just add these kind of text-based cards if you like, but you can also add GitHub issues to these as well. Now, don't worry, I don't go ahead and add every single one of these manually to this board. I'll let you into a little spoiler ahead of time before we get to it later. I use GitHub Actions to go and do that and automate that, and we will see that a bit later. But you can see here, I've got all of these different items here in my to-do, and I could go and have different boards for the different types of content or the different series or whatnot, but given it's just me that works on this absolutely works fine for me. So this one has been completed, so I can go ahead, drag it across to done, and that is now complete there. So that's kind of the issues and the project board side of things. And again, GitHub Actions can go and integrate into some of that, and we'll see a little bit later how that can work there. But let's go back to the main repository for a moment, because the thing that I really want to focus on here is the fact that actually you don't have to go and bring your code to your local machine to be productive. So what I'm going to show you here is a feature which is currently in a beta stage at the moment called GitHub Code Spaces. So the way that I get to GitHub Code Spaces here is on my repository, I can go ahead, click this green code button, open with GitHub Code Spaces, and then I can open a new code space. And we'll just go and do that here and open that in a new tab. So GitHub Code Spaces is effectively this development environment in the cloud where I can go and be productive very quickly. What it's using in the background, as you may see when the logs come up here, is that it's actually just a Docker container being built and run on GitHub. And that Docker container, if we just change tab here, there we go. Oops, there we go. This is the one. I set one up ahead of time, but it's actually closed since I got there. So we'll go and open that one up in a moment again. But here we go. Let's go and bring that one up again. This is the problem, being too prepared for your demos. So we'll come back to that. But you can see this one here is being created. It's finishing the build process in terms of the building the container, and then it will run the container. And what we get is this environment which looks and feels exactly like Visual Studio Code, but rather than it being in my local environment, it's actually in the cloud, in GitHub. And rather than being connecting in through VS Code, I can just connect in through my browser, for example. So we'll go ahead in a moment and take a look at that, because it's currently suspending my code space here. But as I've got some demos set up on there, we'll come back to it and bring that one on again. So let's actually think then about the piece after we've made our changes there. So we've made some changes to our repository. We now want to go ahead, build and deploy those changes. So what you have in your GitHub repository is this thing called GitHub Actions. It's only available on public repositories or private repositories for GitHub Enterprise Server. It's not available for private repositories on github.com. So you can't use it if you've got a private repository, so bear that in mind if you're intrigued by any of this. And GitHub Actions, effectively we have this tab here that we can go and see all the different workflows that we've created. So I have a number of these different workflows. If you're coming from GitLab or Azure DevOps or Azure Pipelines or similar, you might think of them as pipelines, for example. So a workflow and a pipeline are both similar concepts. So these items on the left-hand side are like my generic instances, the pipeline definition or the workflow definition, if you like. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the workflow runs, so the instances of that pipeline or that workflow running. So I could go ahead, I could jump in, for example, to my master workflow here and take a look at the build, the last run there, see what happens. Yeah, everything looks good. Take a look at the publish steps. Everything looks good there as well. So I've got all of the logs and the types of things that we would expect to see. So if I go to the .github folder in my repository, and then we go to workflows here, this is actually a convention inside a GitHub repository. So this is where you store your YAML files or your workflows or pipelines as code for GitHub Actions. So you can go and see in here that I have a number of YAML files. Episode suggestion, for example, master YAML, preview, etc. All of these are different workflows that we just saw on the previous page. Now just remember something I said earlier, that I don't add those GitHub issues automatically to the project boards. I have some automation to go and do that for me. So notice that I have this GitHub action here, or this GitHub action workflow that runs. So all this is doing is going ahead and on some kind of event triggering if it makes sense to go and trigger it. And that is the magic behind GitHub Actions, is it's not just about CI/CD, so when a commit takes place or when a pull request takes place, for example, you can go ahead and trigger based upon other GitHub events. So let's actually go ahead just switch back to the slides and take a look at some examples here to just make that a little more understandable. So as we mentioned there, we have this trigger in a GitHub action workflow. So you typically start off with the name of the GitHub action workflow at the top there. You then have this on keyword, and then you have the type of trigger. So it could be on issue, on push, on pull request, on project, for example. You're not just limited to these CI/CD typical workflows. So if I just go and change my screen, you'll see on the GitHub docs just the sheer extent of these examples that we have here on the right hand side. So it could be releases, it could be a registry package, project cards, issue comments. There's a lot that we can do with GitHub Actions to automate that end-to-end process. So if you think that, you want to go ahead and you're an open source maintainer, for example, you want to go and automatically welcome people who are commenting for the first time, or thank them for their submission, or do something relating to some of those issues being raised and make your life a bit easier, you could consider GitHub Actions for that. Likewise, if you want to go and use GitHub Actions for your builds and your releases, you can go and do that. So really, really powerful and flexible platform here. So next up then, as with other platforms, you can go ahead and run your GitHub Action Runner, as it's known, or sometimes known as an agent in other platforms, on many different platforms, whether that is Windows, whether that is macOS, whether that is Linux, for example. You can go ahead and run it there. Now, there are some publicly hosted GitHub runners which are available for you, but there is also a self-hosted runner available as well. So you can go ahead and host that on your own cloud infrastructure, on your own on-premises, for example. So be aware of that if you need to deploy anywhere private, for example. Now, actually, this next one, I'm just going to bring off screen for a moment. Take a look at these two lines here that talk about uses. So we've got action/checkout and GitHub/super-linter. Then we have an @ and a version number afterwards. Do you notice anything interesting about that naming convention there and about the format of those particular lines? And feel free to drop in the comments if you're listening in and let me know what you think that is here. I'll just give a few seconds. So congratulations if you got it. This convention is the same convention as the name of a GitHub repository. So if you think about this action/checkout here for a moment, if we navigate back to GitHub, and just to go to github.com action/checkout, this is a GitHub repository. And in my workflow file, I was pointing to V2. So if we go and take a look at releases and scroll down, we can see that V2 is a tag and points to a certain version of that repository. So what we're saying effectively is GitHub Actions workflow, use this GitHub action, which is hosted in this other repository, and use this particular version of it. So this particular commit, which is tagged with a V2. And that is the magic behind GitHub Actions. And I love GitHub Actions for that reason, because I think it's going to be a really valuable platform, because if it doesn't already exist there, I or someone else can go ahead and build an action that go and achieves that. So from that perspective, it really builds upon that open source concept that when you think about GitHub and bringing the community along, it's really doing that for GitHub Actions. So a really clever way of building that and approaching that. The one thing I would say though, just to bear in mind, like any kind of dependency that you have in your software development, is making sure you trust whichever dependencies you're bringing in. So that will also go for your GitHub Actions as well. So do you trust the random GitHub action that Chris Reddington has created and put in one of his repositories, for example? You can go ahead, of course, check out the code and see what's going on there, but of course, just bear that in mind. That's now going to be a part of your CI/CD process. Do you necessarily trust that GitHub action? So that's one thing I love about GitHub Actions, is the way how it makes it so easy to expand upon if it's not already there and existing. Now for some additional pieces to be aware of here. The first one is that we now have this concept of environments in GitHub Actions as well. Now, GitHub Actions, uh, the environments functionality came in just before Christmas. So it's not been around for a long amount of time, probably about 4.5 months or so now. And it's a great piece of functionality. It gives you the ability to have manual approvals into a specific environment, gives you the ability to scope secrets down to a given environment as well. So if you think about that, having secrets on a per environment basis is good from a principle of least privilege perspective. And the beauty of GitHub Actions is it will only pull those credentials and those secrets in if that environment exists in the workflow. Otherwise, it doesn't go ahead and bring those in. So using environments is a nice thing to go and do there. Once again, we've got a number of GitHub actions that we're relying upon, and we've got that convention there of this repository and then the @ and the version number of the tag that we're referring to. So you can see we've got one for Azure/login. If we just navigate across, you can see that Azure/login is another example of a GitHub action here. And we can go and take a look at the source, for example, and see what's going in there as well. So again, this open source experience of building the individual GitHub actions, I think, is a really clever way of building GitHub actions overall as a platform. And then finally, we talked about secrets and credentials a moment ago. Now, if you need to go ahead and bring in anything which is dynamic in nature, so referencing variables, referencing maybe some system variables from GitHub, bringing in your secrets, all of these kind of things, what you need to do is you need to go and use this $curly brace syntax. And that is the syntax which is used to evaluate a runtime expression effectively. So then you can go and call these secrets, these GitHub system variables, etc. So that's just a good tip and worth being aware of there. So with that, let's go ahead and jump back to GitHub and go and take a look at some of those additional GitHub Actions pieces. So we talked about GitHub Actions and environments. So if I go to my settings over here on the top right, what you'll see as I scroll down is I have an option for secrets, I have an option for environments. So if we click on secrets first, I have these repository scoped secrets which are available to all of my GitHub actions regardless of which environment that we're deploying to, because they're not necessarily scoped, as you can see here from the repository secrets. But if we click into environments here, you can see I've got a number of different environments listed. So I've got an Azure staging, preview and production. I've also got a staging for GCP and AWS, which I deploy to for my own testing. And you can see that I'm actually holding repository scoped secrets in preview, staging, and production. But in production, I also have a protection rule. And you can see here that in production, I have this required reviewer. So to actually deploy to production, Chris Reddington needs to go ahead and approve that change. And there's also an Azure credentials then in there, which allows me to use that Azure/login task there. So let's go ahead and just take a look one more time here at these environments, because notice that this production.azure, preview.azure, staging.azure maps back to this item here, the environment name in the GitHub Action workflow file that we created there. And that's how you kind of map these two together and understand, which environments do we want to go and bring the secrets into? Where do we want to go and have those checked, for example? That is how you go and do it. So let's actually go ahead and approve the pull request that we made on the preview branch a little bit earlier there for my global Azure updates. So that's going into my dev branch, so my staging Cloud with Chris environment now. Now, it's a really simple change. It's just removing the upcoming flag from 2 pieces of content. So I'm comfortable that that change is actually good. So rather than waiting to review that in staging, we're going to be brave and bold, and we're going to go ahead and push that straight into production here as well. So production update of global Azure talks. There we go. That looks good. And we can see that I've actually got a warning here because it requires all commits to be signed. That's just something that I've turned on. I can actually go and override that though, so that's not a problem as an administrator. So there we go. We have now gone ahead, merged those changes into master. Now if we take a look at GitHub Actions, we'll notice that the staging workflow is running because obviously we merged the changes from the preview branch into staging. And now we've merged the staging changes into master. So what you'll notice is the staging changes will carry on absolutely fine. There'll be no problems in terms of an approval needed, etc., or needing to wait on something manually. Of course, any of these steps could fail along the way, potentially, depending upon what the content is of the repo at that point, because I do static code analysis and the like. But if we jump over to master here now, what we'll see is this publish step won't continue. And it's actually requested my review on that before it goes live into production. So I'm going to say, yep, I'm happy for that to go live. I know the changes that are in there. Everything is good. Let's do this. So now those changes are being rolled out into my production environment. And soon enough, once the CDN has been purged, because that is effectively what this master workflow is doing, it's just going ahead, logging into Azure, uploading the contents to Azure Storage, and purging my CDN. So very, very simple in terms of a workflow and distributing that content globally to my users. So with that, let's just jump back to GitHub Codespaces for a moment, because I do want to make sure we get a moment to take a look into that here and look at that. So let's try that again. Here we go. It's starting up the code space for us here. GitHub Codespaces, as I mentioned, is like having your own instance of Visual Studio Code, but it is hosted in a container on GitHub. So what that means, because it's a container, is you have this consistent development environment. So you can see as I open this up, I made these changes actually just before going live with this particular session here. So you can see the two files I had open are the global Azure files here, and I just made the changes through my GitHub code space. I made the commits, and then I created a pull request all within this VS Code instance running in Codespaces in my web browser. So nothing running local on my machine here, all running on a container in GitHub. Now the beauty of that is even that inner loop of development, I can come ahead in here, I have my terminal, I can go ahead and run Hugo Serve. I can go and open this link right here, and this will be an instance of the website running on that container in GitHub Codespaces, but I'm able to go ahead and access that from my machine here, not running on my local environment at all. So I could go ahead, for example, go to my config file and make a change. So let's go and stop that site from running. You know, we could say Cloud with Chris Global Azure 2021, for example. Go and run that again. And when we tab across to the new browser, you can see that I've changed the title of my website now. So again, we don't have to go ahead and directly start committing to the preview branch or the master branch or the dev branch or whatnot to see the changes after they've gone through the CI/CD process. We can be super productive really quickly by using this approach of GitHub Codespaces, having this dev container with this consistent environment for build tools, the extensions that I need to use, all running in GitHub, easily accessible for me to get going quickly and easily. I'm sure we've all been there. We've needed to go ahead, set up our machines with dependencies, this framework, that framework, another IDE, another tool. GitHub Codespaces makes that super, super easy for us to go ahead and be productive very, very quickly. So let's go ahead now and take a look at that GitHub action, given that we've taken a look at GitHub Codespaces there. So we can see now that the content has been downloaded to the runner. We've logged into Azure. It's been uploaded to the storage account there. Now the CDN is in the process of being purged. So if we just navigate again here and we refresh and go to talks, It's still being purged, so it might not update just yet, but hopefully within the next few minutes or so, we'll be able to see that that content is being updated there as well. I do sometimes have some caching issues on my local Edge instance here, so be aware of that sometimes if you're using CDNs as well. So with that, what I want to just transition us to here for a moment is, obviously this is global Azure, so I just want to pinpoint you to some of the actions that may be useful here for you. So number one, github.com/azure/login. This is a GitHub action built by the Azure engineering team, which helps you go ahead and log into Azure using maybe a service principal or something similar there. There is also an Azure/CLI action as well. So again, github.com/Azure/CLI. And you can go ahead and run anything that you can go and run in the Azure CLI in your GitHub action runner or GitHub workflow runner there exactly, using this particular action here. But there's also this github.com/Azure/actions repository. And this gives you a list of all of the various GitHub repositories that exist, the actions made by the Azure engineering team. Now, actually, there's a great team behind that, and they're looking to the community to really help them expand and build some of the samples of content that is available out there, and some of these GitHub actions as well. So if you're interested in building a GitHub action, it doesn't exist today, and you really want something to be there, go ahead and follow the instructions on how you can go ahead and contribute to the Azure actions, because they're really looking to build a great community around this. So I would encourage you, if you are as passionate about GitHub actions and want to see more happening in that space, more GitHub actions relating to something in Azure that you don't see there yet and you don't want to use the CLI, why not give it a go, embrace the open source journey and try it yourself. Now there's one other piece that I also want to show here as well, and that is the github.com/Azure Actions workflow. So Azure workflow samples, I should say. There we go. Here we go. So as you can see here, github.com/Azure/actions-workflows-samples. These are a number of sample workflows that are available here for you to get started quickly and easily. So if you want to go and build your ASP.NET Core app onto deploy it onto an app service, for example, if you want to go ahead and deploy your ARM templates, or go and build your NuGet packages and deploy them to Azure Artifacts or GitHub packages, for example, there are a load of samples available here for you to go and use. And once again, if there's something here that you want to do and you don't see a sample for it, why not contribute it back to this repository and contribute back to the community and be a part of that community? So I'd really encourage you to take a look at both the github.com/Azure/actions-workflows-samples repository and github.com/Azure/actions as well. So let's just jump back and see. That looks like it's updated. So if we refresh now with the right page this time, here we go. There you go, you can see my production website is now updated, and those talks are now in the past because we're pretty much at the end of this talk here. So let's jump back across here to PowerPoint and start wrapping ourselves up. So I really hope you've enjoyed this session and it's given you some insight into GitHub Actions, how you can use GitHub Actions with Azure, and how I use GitHub and GitHub Actions for cloudwithchris.com. Ultimately, the reason I use GitHub Actions, GitHub, etc., is because the work that I do is about contributing back to the community. So if someone wants me to go ahead and create some type of content or a new episode of a certain type, I want them to be able to be easy as possible to go into my backlog and add it directly for them. If they want to go and contribute some spelling changes or maybe some tweaks to my website because of accessibility or some other reason, I want that to be as simple and easy for them. And ultimately, you can probably sense the passion that I have for GitHub Actions and the open source community. So again, I really want to showcase that you can do some of these things out in the open and use tools like GitHub and GitHub Actions for this. And they are brilliant, brilliant tools. So again, I'd encourage you to go and explore those, take a look at those. And as I said earlier, more than happy to chat further on Twitter or similar if you're interested. So with that, how do you go away and learn more? Because we've just really scratched the tip of the iceberg here. What is next? Well, first off, whether you're brand new to Git, whether you're brand new to GitHub, or maybe you're familiar with them but not necessarily the world's expert at Git or GitHub, and you want to start learning more about GitHub Actions, or maybe you want to learn about CodeQL and Dependabot and some of those things I mentioned earlier, go ahead and check out lab.github.com. GitHub Learning Labs has some amazing content available for you to go and easily skill up on your own pace. Creates a repository in your GitHub account for you, and then you can go ahead and follow a set of structured paths effectively to go and solve some challenges. So very practical, hands-on learning there. So encourage you to go and take a look at GitHub Learning Labs. Next up, Microsoft Learn. Now, I'd be surprised if you haven't heard about Microsoft Learn, because Learn TV is on the main page, for example, of the Global Azure Conference website. But also Microsoft Learn is just an amazing tool where even if you don't want to go and listen to interactive content like videos, etc., there is also loads and loads of different modules and learning paths available, and some of those even roll up into different type of role certifications as well. So some of those learning paths can actually help you towards your Azure accreditations and exams and certifications. And actually even some of the renewals for those exams are now taking place through Microsoft Learn. So again, if you haven't heard of Microsoft Learn, or maybe you have but you haven't really explored, there's some great GitHub content on there. Also Azure, Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365, and much more as well. So encourage you to take a look at that. And finally, of course, my own website, cloudwithchris.com. So www.cloudwithchris.com. I am on YouTube, Cloud with Chris, where you are likely listening to this right now if you're listening live. And I am on Facebook with the same as well. I'd greatly appreciate if you could like this particular video, if you could subscribe as well, and hit that notification bell if you've enjoyed, because that will help you keep up to date as I bring new content. And actually 90% of my listeners are non-subscribers, so I really am trying to grow my presence. I'm working my way towards 500 by the end of 2021, so I'd love your support helping me get there if you've enjoyed this content. And as I mentioned earlier, I am on Twitter as well, at RedOBowen, so please feel free to continue the discussion over there, and would love to chat further. So with that, thank you for tuning in here today. Really appreciate your time here as part of this talk of Global Azure 2021. So again, if you've enjoyed, feel free to tweet using the hashtag Global Azure. And I hope this has inspired you to start taking a look at GitHub Actions and how you can go and use it for your own website, whether that is a blog, a podcast site, or some other kind of application. Go ahead and start your journey with GitHub Actions using some of those tools that we took a look at a little bit earlier there. So thank you for tuning in, and stay safe, stay healthy. Wish you all the best for a lovely weekend ahead, and bye for now.